why did we do FlipFest? So because, it wasn't just about flips, it was also about implementing a lot of those improvements as well. And what we thought was this was a great way of augmenting our backlog. So a lot of the things that the core team would have worked on were actually a lot of the issues that you saw in FlipFest. And we wanted to get it to a point where we can start sharing our backlog with the community and making sure we're both working on high value, high impact tasks, and get it to a point where developers like you are really serving each other, and we're removing ourselves as the blocker in terms of being in the things that's blocking things in the ecosystem. And so we identified kind of the 4 core areas where we felt like we were most limiting. And those are expanding our learning tools. And that's very critical for onboarding new developers, both onto Flow, but blockchain in general. We get a lot of interest from actually non-blockchain developers onboarding for the first time. So it's very important to have some learning paths for them so that they can get introduced and get productive right away. Next up is our standards. So we really need standards to be able to enable the network effects that we need on Flow. So every project shouldn't have to talk to every other project to get things done. We should have some standards in place that makes that a lot easier. And that's really how we get more scale. And finally, our developer tools and SDKs. The big one here, I think, is the iOS one. So we work closely with one of the participants, and they talked to FCL a lot and eventually ended up implementing FCL on with Swift alongside a whole SDK and everything else. And so now that's going to really open up a range of mobile experiences that can be built on iOS that previously wasn't possible. And lastly, we have infrastructure. So obviously, as developers, we don't want to build everything from scratch. It's very critical that we have some basic services in place. But one of the other struggles of Flow is that we want more than one service doing the same thing. And if we have that competition of multiple places to choose from, you can run things locally or you can go to a provider. The more choices you have, the more competition you have, the better you're going to get as a developer to be able to pick from and optimize for your use case. So those are why we chose some of the categories that we did. And of course, we wanted to incentivize you guys to make sure that you put in your best foot forward and completed it to a great level of quality. And to do that, we made sure we had bounties that reflected it. So one thing we wanted to do different than other hackathons is make sure that it wasn't just the winners that were getting paid, and it wasn't going to be a short-term project, but rather something that we know is going to incentivize long-term commitment to the ecosystem. And we felt that the best way to do that was to build on the existing developer tools that are there versus just having a free-for-all on any NFT project that you can get out. So it really meant that if you put in all the work and met all the acceptance criteria, got through someone on the Flow team that approved your PR, that you'd still walk away with a reasonable amount despite you winning or not winning. And that really encouraged a lot of teams to start working together versus like competing against each other, even though that definitely did happen. But eventually you came to a great solution organically rather than competing. And eventually we actually had to add an additional category at the end because some people went so above and beyond the scope of the issues that we felt that we had to compensate them for their current work, but also to maintain the things that they had done and released. So we'll talk about those in a bit. Going over some raw numbers of the funnel that we're looking at. We had 650 registered. You'll see a different number on Hacker Earth if you go there now. I don't believe there was 3,500 applicants. I think it was closer to 650. So I'm going to go with that number. And of those 650, about 50 teams signed up to an issue and wanted to participate. And that meant that there was about 100 milestones up for grabs. And out of those 100 milestones, 82 got completed or received a submission. And from those submissions, 67 of them were eventually accepted and met all our standards and criteria. So that was an 81% acceptance rate. So if you submitted something, 81% chance that eventually through feedback, it was accepted. And lastly, 32 teams that won. So that's almost 2/3, or what Deet was alluding to, about 68% of teams that signed up to an issue walked away with some prize one way or another. All right, one more question. So this one's more of a fun thinking question, and I have a relevant slide to it on the next one. But how long do you think it would take you to complete all the FlipFest tickets if you were working full-time at it? Nice. So have like some general consensus. It would take over a year, I think, for most people. And based on our rough calculations, like that's kind of what we came to as well. So assuming like one milestone on average takes about a week to do, we thought it would probably take 14 months to get through this entire backlog. If you were working on your own and you were some messiah of code that could tackle every single issue like back to back and get through all of it. So that's just kind of trying to quantify some of the more tangible impact, especially for people that aren't developers, to understand kind of the meaning of what we really accomplished at FlipFest. And outside of that, we had over a 20% increase in developer activity. So that's both by GitHub commits and testnet activity. So we got a really good bump out of all the people participating. And lastly, we got 10 brand new tools that are very well documented, working out of the box and ready for people to use. So that was some of the short-term gains, but on the longer term and the horizon, what we're really trying to do is create more developer evangelists. And so this is very similar to kind of what you would get maybe in e-commerce when you ask for an NPS score of how likely are you to recommend this product to a family or friend. And you give a score of 1 to 10, and the 9s and 10s are promoters, and they bring in more customers because they talk so well about that product or service. And similar to that, we want to employ that same strategy here, right? If we can get people to be invested into the ecosystem and say very good things about it because they had a good experience on it, we're likely to attract more. And that's really where the flywheel comes from. So we give reasons for people to dive in, develop that interest, and through events like this, once you are invested, you're more likely to use that knowledge, you're more likely to interact with people that are using that knowledge and eventually get more and more into the ecosystem. And then finally, we want to make it very easy for you to go from your whatever idea you have, make it into reality, and then start evangelizing within the community and become a leader in your own right.